My name's Ed Clark, and I've been working with an agency in Canada called Egale, which has been an advocacy agency for the LGBT community for a number of decades in Canada, advancing their rights. And together, we've been trying to develop a project to deal with LGBT youth who live on the street. Now, we're told that over 20% of the children who live on the street in Toronto come from the LGBT community. In fact, I think our belief is that the number is probably well in excess of that because of the underreporting that happens in this community. We started this project by saying, well, we really don't know the full dimensions of the problem, so the first thing that we should try to do is to get a drop-in center and start to see these youth and see what their issues are. And so about a year ago, we were able, April 1st, a year ago, we were able to launch our first drop-in center. It is now staffed with 3 psychologists and social workers and a number of aid workers to help the children. The problem is much more severe than we originally thought. Almost 80% of the children are inclined to suicide. About 40% of the children are transgender, about 25% Aboriginal. And I think what we've learned is that the children from the LGBT community who end up on the street tend to have multiple vulnerabilities, and they don't have the support group around them to deal with the transition where they realize what their sexual orientation is, and they don't have the support in the family structure or friends, and they end up on the street and are highly, highly vulnerable. We've been working this center, as I said, for about a year. We're now in the process of obtaining a building which we'll refurbish and provide 25 to 30 units for a shelter. Again, because of the number of the transgender population, we're building the shelter around having single rooms for every child. And we hope to then have counseling service available to these youth. Finally, the final stage in the sense of the project is we're working with another agency to look at transition housing. We made ourselves get into the transition housing so that we can move people once they've kind of stabilized out of the shelter and into the transition housing. Why would the private sector get involved, and can you get the private sector involved into projects like this? And it is clear, in fact, that in a lot of philanthropy, people like to invest in more, I'll call them higher status philanthropy. And one of the things that I've been trying to do is to advocate to people who have the means to donate that at least some portion of their philanthropy they should set aside for social causes like this. I would call it true charity, where you're not trying to get status enhancement for yourself, your name on a building. You're really just trying to make the world a better place. So I think that is something that we have to go out and advocate in society, that it is not reasonable to expect that the governments will solve all these problems. And indeed, I would argue that the private sector has a specific role in solving these problems, because a lot of these problems, there isn't a cookie-cutter formula yet today to know how to do it. And so a project that I was involved in where we said, let's break the welfare cycle of single mothers living in shelters, we set out and we now have 75 women who are going through programs to go back to university and get permanent jobs and actually transition them permanently off the welfare system, and equally important, ensure that their children don't stay on the welfare system. Well, in doing that kind of project, we have made this, over the last 10 to 15 years, every year we make modifications to the program as we fine-tune the model. And we frankly, what I said is, if this is my money that I'm investing, we're going to invest it the way a private sector person would. And every time a woman fails, we're going to investigate what went wrong in our program and why did she fail and should changes be made. And we also, within the project, brought in outside consulting firms to review and say what was the benefit to society, what was the benefit to the governments in terms of reduced welfare payments from this kind of investment, is this high rate of return activity. So I think bringing the skill sets that you learn in the private sector to social innovation in these areas is actually quite important. It also, frankly, is when you're financing this thing privately, you don't have to worry about procurement rules. You don't have to worry about a whole set of things that, in fact, slow up these projects. And so we at Christmas had made the decision to open our LGBT counseling center, and I said, I'll finance all of this as long as you're up by April. And we were up by April. You could not possibly do that in a government program. So yeah, I think there is a huge role for the private sector here. I think we have to convince the private sector that social investment is absolutely critical to producing a society in which we want to live, and that they actually have not just money, but they have skills that they can bring to solving many of these social problems. If you step back and say, well, why would someone like me support a project like this? I think there's kind of a number of elements. First off, I have spent a large amount of energy trying to advance LGBT issues. It remains, despite the progress, and Canada's made progress, and now the United States has made progress on such things as legalizing marriage, there is still deep-rooted homophobia in society. And I think you have to continue to work at this issue if we are to transform our society where all people are treated as fundamentally equal. I think the second thing is I've spent a lot of energy as well on homelessness generally. And I think what we've learned again and again, I have a project that I work with for single mothers. We have a project for men over 55 living on the street. Habitat for Humanity is another organization I work with. In every case, we see the same phenomena, that when people find a home and get the security that a home brings, it makes an enormous difference in their lives and allows them to self-heal, to grow, develop, and in a sense to continue on and stabilize their situation. And this is clearly the case in the LGBT community, where, in fact, despite their best efforts, many of our shelters or counseling centers are seen as threatening to the LGBT community. And so having safe places where they can go and feel comfortable are fundamentally important to them. And then finally, the focus on youth in this particular case is because what's so tragic here is that just because a person tells the world who they are, who they truly are, they end up in very difficult circumstances. And you see that generally in homeless, that it's often, a single event that itself you wouldn't have said would lead to a really fundamentally bad situation. But in this case, all a person is trying to be them, be themselves. And then they get on the street, they go to a shelter, they run into homophobia, they go out of the shelter, they're forced into things like the sex trade to survive, and they start using drugs and they start a downward spiral. And so if we can catch this early, if we can find a place where people can go and feel safe and be comforted and get the counseling they need, I think we can break this cycle. And so that's the focus we're trying to do. And we're very pleased with the progress we made. We're daunted by the size of the challenge it is, but we're excited that there is a real answer to this problem if we could just mobilize the resources. So thank you very much.